The motorcycle industry isn't just struggling, it's in freefall and no one's hitting the brakes. Factories are closing, dealerships are collapsing, entire towns built on motorcycling are being wiped off the map. For decades, motorcycles symbolized freedom, rebellion, and the American dream. But today, that dream is shattered. Loyal riders are being abandoned, and corporate greed has driven prices through the roof. This isn't just a market slowdown, it's a full-blown collapse. So how did one of America's most iconic industries fall apart? And can it be saved before it's too late? What's happening? The motorcycle industry wasn't killed by technology or trade, it was killed by culture. Today's younger generations are not racing to motorcycle dealerships or joining weekend riding clubs. Instead, they are walking away from motorcycling entirely, leaving behind an industry that once defined youth identity. A large part of this collapse is rooted in changing values. For today's millennials and Gen Z consumers, motorcycles simply do not carry the same emotional weight. Riding a motorcycle was once a rite of passage, a declaration of freedom. But to younger people raised in the digital age, motorcycling feels less like liberation and more like an unnecessary risk. Growing up with constant news about fatal crashes, financial instability, and climate anxiety has made younger generations far more risk-averse than their parents or grandparents. The idea of strapping on a helmet and roaring down the highway isn't thrilling, it's frightening. But that's only part of the problem. Young people didn't just stop caring about motorcycles, they stopped needing them. If you're finding this story eye-opening so far, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Motorcycles lost their practical purpose. Back in the days, motorcycles were cheap, efficient, and functional transportation, perfect for commuters, students, and working-class Americans. But as the decades rolled by, the motorcycle industry in the United States lost sight of that practicality. Instead of positioning motorcycles as everyday tools, manufacturers sold them as luxury toys, symbols of status, or relics of rebellion. And in doing so, they let the entire point of motorcycling slip away. In Europe, India, and Southeast Asia, motorcycles and scooters are essential. They are the backbone of daily transportation in cities like Delhi, Bangkok, and Rome, where traffic congestion and narrow streets make cars impractical. In those regions, motorcycles are affordable, fuel-efficient, and easy to park, making them the logical choice for millions of people. Small displacement bikes dominate the market because they solve real transportation problems. In America, however, motorcycles evolved into something entirely different. Manufacturers shifted focus away from small, practical machines and instead flooded the market with big, loud, high-performance models. In doing so, they alienated urban riders who just wanted something simple, cheap, and easy to ride. Meanwhile, American cities became less and less motorcycle-friendly. Public transportation improved. Urban infrastructure prioritized cars, bikes, and pedestrians, and new mobility options such as electric scooters, e-bikes, and ride-sharing apps offered young people far more accessible ways to get around without the financial and safety risks of owning a motorcycle. And just when motorcycles seemed irrelevant for practical use, a new cultural force emerged, one that further distorted their image and made them even less appealing to serious new riders: the rise of reckless flex culture. If you've spent any time on social media in the past 5 years, you've seen it. The viral videos of riders pulling wheelies down crowded freeways, weaving between cars at 100 miles per hour, or racing police helicopters for clout. What used to be fringe behavior has now become mainstream content, consumed by millions on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. The rise of super squid culture didn't just embarrass the motorcycle community, it wrecked its future. The term squid has always existed in motorcycling circles, used to describe reckless, unskilled riders who show off and put themselves and others in danger. But social media transforms squidding into a spectacle, a brand, a flex. Young riders now buy leader bikes they can't control, slap a GoPro on their helmets, and film themselves breaking traffic laws for internet points. The algorithm rewards it. Millions of views, viral fame, and monetization opportunities all incentivize the most dangerous behavior. This new form of flex culture reshaped how non-riders and potential new riders see motorcycling. Instead of seeing motorcycles as fun, practical, or empowering, the public increasingly associates them with chaos, danger, and arrogance. Parents steer their kids away from riding. Cities crack down on motorcycle groups. Insurance premiums skyrocket. But the real damage goes deeper. For every serious, safety-conscious rider, there's now a stigma attached, a suspicion that they're just another squid looking for attention. The community has been polluted by an endless cycle of dangerous content that encourages inexperienced riders to jump on high-powered bikes far beyond their skill level, often leading to tragic consequences. And if you thought the damage stopped there, it didn't. Because while the industry was alienating young riders with dangerous flex culture, it was also ignoring entire communities that could have saved motorcycling's future. The industry's gender and inclusivity blind spot. Women riders, minority communities, and younger, diverse consumers were either ignored or pandered to with tone-deaf marketing campaigns. Manufacturers missed a massive opportunity to grow the rider base beyond the same aging group of enthusiasts. Instead of investing in inclusive riding communities, affordable beginner bikes, or outreach programs, the industry doubled down on selling expensive, intimidating machines to the customers they already had. The numbers don't lie. By the year 2024, women accounted for nearly 20% of motorcycle owners in the United States, a figure that had doubled since the year 2009. But the industry did almost nothing to actively cultivate this growth. The same can be said for Black, Latino, and Asian communities, many of whom ride motorcycles in urban environments out of necessity, not leisure. Yet manufacturers fail to offer products or experiences tailored to their needs. This blind spot cost the industry dearly. Instead of welcoming new riders and expanding the definition of who a motorcyclist could be, manufacturers locked themselves into an outdated identity. They assumed the same old riders would keep the industry alive forever. They were wrong, but this was only the beginning of the collapse, because while culture and community crumbled, an even bigger betrayal was happening behind the scenes, one that would wreck the industry's foundation. The displacement creep catastrophe. The downfall of the motorcycle industry was not just driven by cultural shifts or changing demographics, it was worsened, accelerated even, by the manufacturers themselves. One of the most destructive mistakes they made was falling into the trap of displacement creep. This wasn't an accident or a fluke, it was a conscious, strategic decision made over the course of years, under the false belief that bigger is always better. But that philosophy didn't just fail, it poisoned the very foundation of motorcycling. Displacement creep refers to the gradual increase in engine size across all categories: beginner bikes, middleweights, and even super sports. What once started as nimble, simple machines quickly morphed into bloated, overpowered, and overpriced beasts. Manufacturers, desperate to comply with increasingly strict emissions regulations, found an easy workaround: make engines larger. A slightly larger displacement allowed them to reduce hydrocarbon emissions, skirt regulatory hurdles, and advertise higher performance numbers. But the cost of this decision was far greater than any emissions fine. By pushing beginner bikes from 300 cubic centimeters to 500 cubic centimeters and middleweights from 600 cubic centimeters to 800 cubic centimeters or beyond, they distorted the entire product ladder. Entry-level bikes became too powerful, too heavy, and too expensive for true beginners. Middleweight bikes became indistinguishable from leader-class motorcycles in both power output and price tag. It wasn't just the spec sheets that ballooned. Prices followed. With every bump in engine size came a corresponding bump in price, complexity, and maintenance costs. A simple 300 cubic centimeter sport bike that used to cost $5,000 suddenly became a 500 cubic centimeter, $8,000 machine with bloated electronics packages, heavier frames, and unnecessary bells and whistles. But displacement creep was only part of the story. The real betrayal came when the people tasked with selling these machines turned motorcycling into a financial trap. The dealership trap. Walking into a motorcycle dealership in 2025 feels less like entering a rider's paradise and more like stepping into a predatory financial office. For many first-time buyers, the dealership experience is not just intimidating, it is actively designed to extract every last dollar from them. And that is one of the biggest reasons the motorcycle industry crashed. Over the past decade, dealerships across America shifted their business model from customer service to profit maximization. It started small, a few destination fees here, a setup fee there. But by 2024, it had become standard practice for dealers to add thousands of dollars in markups, hidden fees, and inflated interest rates to every transaction. A motorcycle listed at $6,500 rarely left the dealership for less than $8,000 out the door. Buyers were hit with freight fees, documentation fees, assembly charges, extended warranties, and aggressive financing packages that saddled them with outrageous interest rates. And for younger first-time buyers, those who should have been the industry's future, these dealership tactics felt like a hostile gauntlet. The industry's refusal to modernize dealership operations, especially as the rest of the economy shifted toward direct-to-consumer models, further alienated potential buyers. Younger generations used to the transparency and convenience of online shopping were baffled by a dealership system built on obfuscation, upselling, and paperwork traps. The beginner bike betrayal. Affordable, approachable, and simple to maintain, these machines welcomed new riders into the fold. But somewhere along the way, manufacturers decided that beginners weren't worth their time or investment. Instead of nurturing new riders, motorcycle companies priced them out of the hobby entirely. Entry-level bikes that once cost $4,000 crept past $6,000. Manufacturers stuffed these machines with unnecessary technology packages, electronics riders did not ask for, and styling borrowed from premium models. All so they could justify bloated price tags. The irony is that none of these upgrades made motorcycles more accessible or enjoyable for beginners. Instead, they overwhelmed new riders with complicated rider modes, aggressive styling, and insurance costs that made ownership financially irresponsible. The average first-time rider in 2025 faces a simple, grim equation: spend $8,000 on a beginner bike or walk away from motorcycling entirely. And many are walking away. The result is that the entire entry-level market collapsed. With fewer new riders entering the hobby, the industry began to hollow out from the bottom. Motorcycle culture, once built on generations of new riders discovering the joy of two wheels, began to rot from within. But it wasn't just the newcomers who were betrayed. The industry also turned its back on its most loyal, longtime supporters, the riders who made motorcycling what it was. And that betrayal was even more unforgivable. The death of iconic models. There was a time when motorcycles weren't just machines. They were icons. Bikes like the Honda CB 750, the Suzuki SV 650, or the Yamaha R6 weren't just products, they were part of people's identities. Affordable, reliable, and exhilarating, these models built the motorcycle community brick by brick. But as the industry chased higher profit margins, those icons began to vanish. Manufacturers discontinued beloved models, citing emissions regulations, declining sales, or cost efficiency. In reality, it was a calculated move to force riders upmarket to spend $20,000 on bloated, over-engineered flagship machines. This wasn't evolution, it was betrayal. Riders who had spent decades loyal to brands like Kawasaki, Yamaha, and Honda watched helplessly as their favorite bikes disappeared. In their place came grotesquely expensive, overcomplicated motorcycles designed to appeal to the wealthy dentist or midlife crisis crowd, not the average rider who simply wanted a fun, reliable bike. The death of iconic models shattered the heart of motorcycling. It alienated the very people who had kept the industry alive through recessions, changing trends, and cultural shifts. These riders didn't want adaptive cruise control or blind spot monitoring. They wanted light, nimble, mechanically pure machines, and the industry took them away. The backlash was immediate and intense. Forums, comment sections, and motorcycle rallies filled with angry riders lamenting the loss of the bikes they loved. But the manufacturers didn't listen. They doubled down on luxury machines, betting that enough affluent buyers would keep their margins healthy. That bet failed. The collapse of the middleweight and entry-level segments, combined with the betrayal of existing riders, created an industry that could no longer sustain itself. New riders couldn't afford to enter. Loyal riders had nothing left to buy. But the story doesn't end here. Another devastating blow was unfolding far from the big cities, one that would strike at the very heart of American motorcycle culture. Motorcycling abandoned rural America. The decline of motorcycling in urban areas was one thing, but the collapse in rural America was even more catastrophic. For decades, small towns and rural communities were the beating heart of American motorcycle culture. Local dealerships, weekend rider clubs, county fair bike shows, these were the lifeblood of the industry. But as rural economies declined, motorcycling vanished alongside them. It began with dealership closures. As sales declined, manufacturers consolidated, cutting off small-town dealers that had served their communities for generations. Without local dealers, rural riders had nowhere to test ride bikes, get servicing, or build community. The few remaining dealers were often hours away, and with rising costs, fewer rural riders were willing to make the trip. Then came the loss of community infrastructure. Local motorcycle events disappeared as attendance dwindled. Rural rider clubs faded away as older members retired and younger residents moved to cities. The small-town biker culture that once defined America's heartland became a relic of the past. The economic collapse of rural America compounded this problem. As factories closed, farming profits shrank, and small businesses disappeared, disposable income dried up. For many, motorcycles became an impossible expense. Families who once owned multiple bikes sold them off to pay bills. Young people who might have taken up riding instead left town in search of stable employment. And as rural motorcycling culture vanished, so too did a vital part of the industry's soul. American motorcycling had always been about freedom, rebellion, and working-class grit. But in rural communities, that identity was crushed by economic reality. And as the dust settled, the industry faced a new, uncomfortable truth. Its problems were far bigger than young people losing interest. They were systemic, structural, and deeply embedded in the economic collapse of middle and rural America. But the ripple effects of this crisis were not over yet. The labor revolt begins. The collapse of the motorcycle industry was not just a story of lost sales and corporate failure, it was a human tragedy that ripped through the heart of America's blue-collar workforce. When the layoffs began, they came fast, hard, and without warning. Entire factories shuttered overnight. Thousands of mechanics, assembly line workers, dealership staff, and parts suppliers found themselves on the unemployment line. Not because they had failed, but because the industry had. These were not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were people. Many of them third-generation factory workers, small-town dealership owners, service technicians, and lifelong enthusiasts who had built their careers and identities around motorcycles. In places like Milwaukee, Toledo, and Sturgis, entire communities revolved around motorcycling. When the big layoffs hit in 2024 and 2025, it wasn't just jobs that disappeared, it was the cultural fabric of these towns. What made the situation worse was how sudden and ruthless the closures were. Motorcycle manufacturers, desperate to cut costs, quietly downsized production facilities without warning local governments or labor unions. Workers who had spent 20 or 30 years assembling engines and frames were handed severance packages that barely covered 3 months of living expenses. The betrayal ran deep. Many workers felt they had given their lives to the industry only to be discarded when profits dried up. It wasn't long before the outrage boiled over. In early 2025, protests erupted outside shuttered factories and corporate headquarters. Former employees marched through the streets of Milwaukee carrying signs that read, "Motorcycles built our families. You broke them. And no jobs, no bikes, no future." Union leaders were quick to organize. In states like Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, blue-collar unions that once focused on auto workers expanded their reach to include motorcycle assembly workers and dealership staff. They launched class-action lawsuits against major manufacturers, accusing them of unjust terminations, wage theft, and failure to negotiate plant closures in good faith. But it wasn't just about lost wages. Workers demanded accountability for an entire generation of corporate mismanagement that had decimated an industry they loved. Their message was simple: the collapse of motorcycling was not inevitable. It was manufactured by boardroom decisions that prioritized executive bonuses over American livelihoods. Yet even as the protests grew louder, there was an even bigger storm brewing in Washington, D.C. Political and regulatory backlash. When the first factory protests hit the news cycle, politicians smelled blood in the water. In an election year defined by economic anxiety and crumbling American industries, the collapse of the motorcycle industry became an irresistible political weapon. Governors, senators, and presidential candidates lined up to point fingers and promise action. What began as scattered protests soon transformed into a national controversy. Both major political parties jumped into the fray, each spinning the story to their advantage. One side blamed greedy corporations and corporate offshoring for gutting American jobs. The other accused over-regulation, environmental mandates, and woke corporate policies for driving manufacturers out of business. By mid-2025, congressional hearings were underway. CEOs of major motorcycle companies were dragged before Senate committees and grilled on live television. They were asked why they axed affordable models, why they let prices spiral out of control, and why they ignored the concerns of workers, dealers, and customers alike. For the first time in decades, the motorcycle industry's failures were national news, and the public outrage was palpable. The political fallout didn't stop there. State legislatures introduced bills aimed at tightening dealership oversight, capping interest rates on motorcycle financing, and forcing manufacturers to justify factory closures with at least 6 months' notice. Some states passed laws mandating severance packages for laid-off dealership employees and unionized workers. But the biggest shock came when Congress proposed a federal tariff on foreign-made motorcycles. Framed as a move to protect American jobs, the tariff threatened to raise prices on every Japanese, Indian, and European motorcycle imported into the country. Critics warned that this would only drive prices higher for consumers, but the political class was more interested in headlines than long-term consequences. There was also talk of breaking up the traditional dealership system entirely. Consumer advocates argued that motorcycle manufacturers should be forced to adopt a direct-to-consumer sales model, cutting out exploitative dealership fees and giving buyers more power. The political and regulatory backlash was swift, messy, and far-reaching. But while Washington waged its war over who was to blame, another battle was quietly unfolding overseas. Because as America fought over a broken industry, foreign competitors were already moving in to fill the void. Foreign brands take over. While American politicians bickered over tariffs and labor protections, Japanese, Indian, and European motorcycle giants were already seizing the opportunity. Brands like Honda, Yamaha, Royal Enfield, and BMW had long admired the American market from the sidelines, but now they saw an opening to dominate. As American manufacturers laid off workers and closed plants, foreign brands ramped up production. They flooded global markets with affordable, reliable, and commuter-friendly motorcycles, precisely the kinds of machines American companies had abandoned. Honda's small displacement bikes, Royal Enfield's affordable cruisers, and BMW's middleweight adventure bikes quickly gained ground. In 2025 alone, new motorcycle registrations in India and Southeast Asia grew by over 15%, while American motorcycle exports plunged to their lowest level since the 1980s. Europe and Asia had cracked the code. Offer simple, efficient, and practical motorcycles for real-world riders, not overpriced luxury machines tailored to aging hobbyists. These foreign brands didn't just sell bikes, they reshaped global motorcycle culture. Events like MotoGP and the Isle of Man TT increasingly spotlighted Asian and European manufacturers, while American brands faded into irrelevance. Motorcycle content creators shifted their focus too. YouTube channels and social media influencers began featuring Kawasaki Ninjas, KTM Dukes, and Royal Enfield Himalayans, bikes that real people could actually afford and ride. The collapse of America's motorcycle industry wasn't just an economic story, it was a cultural shift. For the first time in modern history, the image of the motorcycle rebel, once synonymous with American brands, had been replaced by practical, community-driven global motorcycling culture. But as foreign brands tightened their grip, a question lingered. Was there any way for American motorcycling to claw its way back from the brink? Can motorcycling be saved? The motorcycle industry was broken, no doubt about it. Factories shuttered, dealerships gutted, and American brands humiliated on the global stage. But buried beneath the rubble was still a path to survival, if the industry was brave enough to take it. The solution wasn't complicated. It required three things: simplify, adapt, and reconnect with real riders. First, the dealership system had to die. Direct-to-consumer sales, pioneered by companies like Tesla in the auto industry, could eliminate inflated fees, predatory financing, and outdated sales tactics. Motorcycle buyers deserved transparency, fair pricing, and the ability to order their bike without dealership exploitation. Second, manufacturers had to stop chasing unattainable margins by bloating motorcycles with unnecessary technology and oversized engines. What the next generation of riders wanted was clear: lightweight, efficient, and affordable bikes that made city commuting fun and accessible. A shift towards smaller displacement, sub-$6,000 motorcycles, combined with expanded electric bike offerings, could reignite interest among young urban riders. Finally, the industry needed to embrace the idea that motorcycling wasn't just about big engines and Sunday rides. It was about freedom, affordability, and practicality. A young rider in New York or San Francisco didn't want a $30,000 cruiser, they wanted a two-wheel solution to daily transportation. Until the industry understood that, the collapse would continue. Some brands, like Royal Enfield and Honda, were already proving that this model could work. But whether American manufacturers could adapt remained to be seen, because one thing was now certain: if the motorcycle industry failed to change course, it would not survive the next decade. The cultural collapse, corporate betrayal, and economic fallout of the past 3 years had left deep scars. The only question left was whether the industry could finally learn from its mistakes, or whether it would become just another relic of America's manufacturing past. And as the dust settled, it became clear: the future of motorcycling would never be the same again. Do you think the motorcycle industry can still be saved? Or is it too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button.